That was a whistle-stop tour of the NREC-MD. Over the next number of minutes, Susan and I will just provide a very brief overview of some of the key areas, and these are based on the questions that have been submitted by participants. And again, we could do a lot longer on this, but we don't have the time, so we're going to fly through it. The slides will be available, and I suppose keep in mind that a lot of these are observations. So again, we welcome any comment on that. So one of the questions that we have received was, how does the process actually work? And it does vary slightly between the committees, depending on the remit of the committees, but it broadly looks like this. So I will speak to each of those stages separately, very quickly. So applications are submitted at the moment based on a application deadline, which is generally set about 2 weeks before the next committee meeting. And the National Office team reviews the submitted applications to ensure that only valid applications are put forward for the NREC review. So that means that we review the documentation, ensure that everything is there. And since May, we have processed approximately 850 applications. Then once the applications are validated and the agenda is set out and approved by the chairperson, the NRECs receive the agenda and the documentation via an online reading room. And that's approximately 10 days before the meeting. So generally from the deadline to the meeting, it's fairly quick. Each application is assigned reviewers. And I suppose here I would like to highlight that actually, whilst that is the case, every committee member should have and generally has an awareness of all applications. All meetings have been held virtually, and part of that is because the whole office was established during pandemic, but given the geographic span of our membership, this is how we envisage the committee meetings will continue to be held in the foreseeable future. They're quorum meetings, so each need to be attended by minimum 7 members, including chairperson and deputy chairperson. And I'd like to say that I don't think we ever got to such low number in any of the main meetings. Generally, they're highly attended. So again, just reflecting the commitment of our members. And the committee as such, as a whole, arrives at a decision. So at the moment, if the decisions are either favorable with conditions, unfavorable, or, as I said already, the committee can issue requests for further information. And on the NREC-MD side, we generally ask for a response to such requests within 2 weeks in order to be able to bring the response to the next meeting and in order to be able to issue a decision within the timelines set out by the regulations. So once the meeting is finished, then the National Office drafts the letters that then get approved by the chairperson and or relevant committee members, and they are sent to the applicants. And again, this is specific to the MD. As per regulations or legislation, the applicants have 10 days to accept the decision and the conditions or indicate whether they intend to appeal the decision. Then following the meetings, so the meeting minutes are compiled and they are generally approved at the next meeting. So therefore, there's always at least a month delay between the meeting being held and the meeting minutes being published on the website. So this is important to keep in mind. And the same goes for the decisions. And I suppose just one frequent query that we often get is a question about, oh, can you send me can you please send us the list of members who reviewed the application? And I suppose just going back to the previous point, it's always the committee as a whole. And if and I suppose in Ireland, we do have those committees fairly clearly defined. So in some countries, we know that there is one broad committee and various members are being drawn out that attend different meetings. That's not the same case for us. So generally, we would recommend that if you're interested in finding out who reviewed the application, either check the meeting minutes when they're published or just have a look at the list of membership, because realistically, that is the group of people who has reviewed it. Okay, one more from me, I think, and then we're going to go back to Susan. So combination studies. So what are combination studies? So these are generally studies that involve both medicinal product and a device, and usually the device is used to enable the delivery of medicine, so drug-eluting stents or inhalers, etc., etc., etc. And I suppose key thing to highlight here is that certain types of combination studies are subject to authorization by both the clinical trial and medical device team of the HPRA, and the same applies to the NREC. So they're also subject to review by both committees, the NREC-CT and NREC-MD. Currently, this review is carried out separately by the two committees. So again, two separate applications need to be then sent to the national office for each of for the relevant aspects of each application. We have seen so far one such study, which has been, I think, a source of great learning for everyone involved in the process, from the applicants to HPRA to ourselves. And I suppose on one hand, we highly recognize the burden of having to send in two applications, but also I think we have been all assured by the robustness of the process by having both committees look at the specific aspects that fall within their remit. Okay, sorry, and my mouse is not working. No, one more for me. Okay, data protection. So again, these were frequent queries that have been submitted to us before the meeting, and again, in the interest of time, this will be a whistle-stop tour, and there is a lot more comprehensive presentations available. But I suppose the key points to remember are that all research that involves processing of any personal data must be able to demonstrate compliance with both legal requirements and the ethical principles. And I suppose the query we have is, why does the NREC need to see the DPIA, or why does the NREC ask about data protection? Well, this is because they need to be ensured that legally compliant data protection measures are in place for each study to safeguard the interests of participants. So you can't separate those two things. Whilst they are separate, they're very interlinked because they still speak to the rights of the participants. And generally, the data protection impact assessment is a tool or a mechanism that is used to identify and mitigate any data protection related risks, and again, measures in place that are in place for each of the research study. Having a study specific DPIA is also a mandatory requirement under GDPR and the Data Protection Act of 2018, or the specific health research regulation part, for studies that are deemed high risk for processing of personal data. And by default, actually, almost it will be very rare. I suppose so far we are yet to receive a study that would not fall under high risk. By default, if you're involving any health data, any sensitive data, it is deemed high risk. It requires a DPIA. And what we would generally ask and recommend is that the study is completed by the data controller for each study, and that it is reviewed by the relevant data protection officer. And the evidence of a DPIA must be documented as a part of the DPIA process. Again, we recognize that at the moment it is quite a big challenge to access the hospital side DPOs, that is a massive bottleneck. And we recognize that is a challenge. However, there is still, the legal requirements are still there. So, wherever possible, we try and meet applicants halfway, but ultimately the DPO really needs to be included, or some sort of a feedback in every application. And then in the bottom of the slide, I have linked our guidance on data protection, as well as really the HSE Research and Development Department or section have held really comprehensive events on data protection for applicants. So again, I would recommend that you have a look at those slides and presentations.
Thank you, Lucia. I'm going to take this slide on consent and capacity, in which we received a lot of queries in advance, so thank you for those. There are, as Lucia said, regarding data protection, it's more complicated than I could highlight here in one slide. It could do a whole webinar on consent and capacity, but to just flag that for participation in a trial, there's consent to participate and there's consent for data processing. So to participate in a trial, consent can only ever be valid where it's informed, freely given, and the person giving it has the capacity to consent. The participant encouraged to involve someone, for a family member with a close relationship or other, who's familiar with their will and preference, beliefs and values. Although this is not a form of legal consent, the individual is still consenting themselves. And in a CTIMP, there is the element of a legally designated representative, as defined as legislation, when someone does not have the capacity to consent. And just to highlight as well, an impartial witness cannot consent on behalf of a participant under Irish law. Consent for data processing is a separate issue. Only the person themselves can provide consent for the processing of their personal data. If this explicit consent is not or cannot be obtained, only irreversibly anonymized data can be processed, or the researcher must seek a consent declaration from the HRCDC, and they would give much greater guidance on what that involves. In terms of valid consent and also consent for future use, the aspect of valid consent, it must be informed, specific, named, granular, unbundled, as in listed separately, freely given, must be easy to withdraw, and it must be recorded. And this aspect is facilitated to the participant information leaflet, which our committee will always looking at in great detail to ensure this is covered. What about future use of data and samples? So a phrase such as, I give my permission for data to be stored and for possible future research unrelated to the study without further consent is not valid. This would fall under blanket consent. Consent must continue to be specific, explicit, and informed as possible, as so far as is possible. It's recommended to seek consent in a tiered format, as mentioned, so each aspect is separated out to give consent to, and to give that participant as much choice as possible into what they do and do not consent to. Specific considerations fall in specific cases, and I have linked some in these underlying situations. I mentioned the capacity to consent. Emergency situations, there's different considerations there, and there is new aspects under the clinical trials regulation in which deferred consent may exist in an emergency situation, and there's a very good article under the CTO Article 35 which can be consulted there. Children have their own specific requirements as expected, and in such applications where an applicant is coming to us with these specific situations, the documentation should clearly outline the approach to capacity, the process of determining capacity, all relevant consent and consent forms should be included, safeguards in place should be highlighted, compliance with European and Irish national regulations as well as policies should be consulted. The HSE National Consent Policy is going to be published in early December, I understand, and it's a fantastic resource for understanding consent and ensuring alignment. Common clarifications in terms of these aspects required by the NRECs often include transparency around transfer of personal data to third countries or to other organisations. At what point the personal data is coded or anonymised in that study. References to the Data Protection Act 2018 with health research regulations as we know them in the participant materials to refer the participant in Ireland to them. We often see reference to rules and regulations from other jurisdictions, mainly the UK, which should not be included. They're not applicable here. And there should be separation of consent for participation in the study and that data processing. It should be really clear to the participant that they can take part in the study, but they do not have to consent to future research. They are still eligible to continue to take part in that study. There should be consistency about data retention periods, and then consent versus assent for 16 to 18-year-olds should be clarified. And there's a lot more to that, which is linked in those links. I'm handing back to you.
This is me now. Yeah. So the role of gatekeeper, and this has been, I suppose, a specific area and a safeguard that has popped up quite frequently in the recent months on the side of the NREC-MD. And we have received a number of questions on the role. So I'd like to just clarify what is generally meant by it and why that is a requirement or recommendation from the NREC. Oh, right. Apologies, my slides just stopped working there. So I suppose it ties in very well with the slides on consent that Susan was talking about. And really, the role of a gatekeeper is a safeguard to minimize any perception of coercion and to also further facilitate informed consent. So generally, a gatekeeper, as they're described, is a person who is not directly involved in care for participants. So therefore, they are an independent research nurse or independent research assistant that works as a part of the study team, but are not necessarily involved in the clinical care. And the NREC-MD would see this process as the best practice in terms of, again, enrolling participants. So all prospective participants should be approached by this gatekeeper, and they should talk them through the participant information leaflet, explain them the study, and also give them the opportunity to ask any questions from the study PI or their clinician, etc., etc. So again, they can revert to the PI for any questions that they may have, but then again, to minimize any perception of coercion, they should revert to the gatekeeper for the consent process. So we are very aware that this is very specific to devices at the moment, because again, under clinical trials, it has to be directive. It has to be the site PI that signs the consent form. So it is quite different on those two sides. Again, there will be probably some changes that are stemming from the regulations in terms of broadening up the scope for the person who signs the consent forms. But this is, I suppose, one of the key reasons why this condition is generally just set by the NREC-MD. And this also brings me to the next point, which is the point about vulnerable participants. So when we talk about vulnerable participants, we talk generally about participants in emergency situations with diminished capacity, minors, pregnant or breastfeeding. However, I suppose that has been raised a number of times at the NREC meetings, is anyone in receipt of care is to some degree vulnerable because you're dependent on your healthcare professional. So I suppose it's what the committee always looks for is having an awareness of that unequal relationship. But speaking more specifically to these participants, as we have seen over the last number of applications that would have involved very diverse groups of potential participants, the NRECs in general really value and encourage inclusion in the conduct of studies. And generally, if there is a blanket exclusion of a certain group of participants that arguably could be included, the committee generally looks for justification of such inclusion or exclusion. One of them would be often women of childbearing potential. You know, in some of these studies, they could easily be facilitated, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes down to compliance with then the committee also looks for compliance with relevant regulations. So both CTR, CTD, and MDR and IVDR have specific articles that outline, again, specific safeguards that need to be in place for each of these applications. And then also what the committee generally looks for is, again, having an awareness of and outlining in the application documentation any implications on consent and data processing. And I suppose when it comes down to the data processing, the one that has been popping up more and more recently has been in relation to basically the rights of the child. So again, if pregnancy outcomes and child outcomes are monitored as a part of a study, what happens with their data that may be stored for 25 years when that child reaches an adult stage of consent, etc. So again, giving a consideration to those aspects is something that the committee generally looks for. And then, of course, the committee is always looking for any additional documentation and assent forms, etc., etc. So again, sometimes we see that these populations are to be included, but none of the additional documentation is provided. So it's something to keep in mind. Okay. And Susan.
Thank you, Lucia. So we got some questions in advance about the reporting requirements, and I'll fly through this one. It's quite straightforward, but under the clinical trials, as you know, we're in a transition period. So I'll highlight both aspects. So under the clinical trials directive, which is on its way out, but still in existence for those approved, they must notify the NREC-CT of SUSARs and DSURs. Annual progress and safety reports are submitted to the NREC on our NREC template, which I've linked there. For any study which is not yet transitioned to the NREC system, the local REC under which that trial is approved is still notified of the SUSARs and DSURs, and the NREC has no role in corrective measures at this point. Under the clinical trial regulation, all of these safety notifications will come through the CTIS online system, which I spoke about. The HPRA will lead on the assessment of these, and the NREC-CT is involved at the request of the HPRA. No notification is required outside of CTIS, so all email and those correspondence will be gone, and the NREC-CT will work with the HPRA on corrective measures as required. Under medical devices, annual progress and annual safety reports are submitted again on our NREC templates. SUSARs, DSURs, urgent safety measures and protocol deviations must be reported, and there's an end of study notification and report must come into the NRECs as well. Another question which came to us in advance, and thank you for submitting these, is what are some common reasons why applications are deemed invalid? So both Lucia and I highlighted in our presentations the volume coming to the committees, and you'll have seen those that received a decision and those that were reviewed and deemed invalid. So some of the application validation takes place on cut-off day for the NREC-CT trials and MD, and one of the common reasons is that all relevant documentation listed in the application checklist may not be included, or there may not be, for example, as Lucia highlighted, a DPIA with DPO input, which is essential. Signatures may be lacking. Documents must be accessible. They must be in original PDF format rather than scanned copies, as these may be converted with document readers, etc., for committee members. And if a document is not included, justification must be provided. For substantial amendments, justification for that amendment must be provided, and the application fee must be paid with evidence of that fee.
So I'm mindful of the time. We have only a couple of minutes left, and we'd like to do a couple of live questions as well with Emily shortly. But this is the last section, so this is about the key, our typical and our considerations. And there is quite a lot in these slides, so I'm going to really briefly just talk about the key areas. So one of them is the application documentation. It really should be, or possibly must be, completed in a really comprehensively and in accessible language. So again, if there's blanket fields where there is no justification for it, it's generally deemed invalid, and the committee will then generally find that as not, we'll look at it not very favorably. Then there's obviously a lot of considerations in terms of the design and the conduct of the studies, and the same goes also for the team around the study. So again, often we see PI-CVs that are very brief, which is on one hand brilliant, but on the other hand, it's often not clear whether they have the relevant expertise in the area or in being a lead of such studies of similar scale. And then when it comes down to recruitment of participants, we talked about this. So who contacts them? What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria? And what are the various justifications for this? Care and protection of participants. So insurance and indemnity agreements. We know that this can be a bit of a minefield. And I have already answered one of the questions. We would really recommend that all applicants consult the State's Claims Agency document on the required insurance and indemnity policies in place for each study. And then also, I suppose, for financial arrangements and participant compensations are often considered by the committee members. When it comes down to then protection of confidentiality of participants/volunteers. So again, what will happen with the data, all of the data protection aspects that we've discussed. How is the informed consent process being done? Is the information sufficient, etc., etc.? And then I suppose the last part there is community consideration. So number one, how will the results be disseminated? Will the participants be informed of this? And also, while it's not always entirely possible, the committee always likes to know if there has been any PPI involvement in the design of the study or even in the design of the participant documentation. So that's us done talking through, I suppose, the prepared questions. So I would like to invite Emily to join us back in here, because I know she has been monitoring some of the questions. And Sue, I think maybe we can stop sharing. Brilliant.
Fantastic. That was a massive comprehensive overview, Lucia. So thank you very much for that. We have quite a few questions actually in the live chat. So this is going to be like a mastermind with a quick fire round for both of you. So hopefully we can maybe just clarify some of these questions. Sue, I might just throw a question to you, if that's okay, regarding the CTR transition. The question is it likely that the volume of substantial amendments will continue to be high? And, you know, how is the office prepared for that? That's a...
Yeah, thank you for that, Emily. And I'll try and be brief. As I touched on, we're at a steady state at the moment, and we're continuing to prepare. They may fall off, but we need to prepare for them not to fall off, because or drop, because that's the capacity we need to have within the office to continue at that level. They continue to come in. They may drop off in that part one aspects of substantial amendments under the CTR will predominantly go to the HPRA. Now that's a generalization, but you know, an IB or a labeling or those type of things will specifically go to the HPRA and not to our committees under the CTR, or minimized input. So we are prepared in terms of our additional committee members, our additional staff members, our 4 meetings per month already in the calendars, and acting as if that level will continue is our plan.
Yeah, and I know you're working really hard. You're constantly kind of fine-tuning processes and procedures within the kind of the team and what they do. So I mean, ultimately we don't want to have another boot camp, because I think that was quite an intense period of time for the office and the members. Thanks, Sue. Lucia, I'm just wondering, would you be able to maybe add some clarity around, I suppose, the respective roles of the local and national committees? There was a question around, you know, having to go to both the national, the NRECs, and the local committee, multiple local committees for studies. So would you like to address that one?
So I briefly touched on it in my presentation, and as I said, and as I like to emphasize, is for studies that fall under the regulations, so under the clinical trials regulation or the clinical trials directive even, and the medical device, the 2 medical device regulations. the NRECs are the only recs that have been authorized to issue a rec opinion. So basically, those are the only valid rec opinions that the HPRA will consider in their authorization of such study or trial. Now, that also means that realistically applicants should not be applying to their local recs. However, the applicants need to engage with the site on the relevant approvals in place. So this is, that all of the agreements and whatever site requires in terms of having an assurance that the study will be carried out in compliance with their local guidelines. That's a separate process. So again, we would really encourage that applicants engage with the site before they would come to us, because again, that can later on be reflected in the documentation, etc., etc. So we would recommend that there is at least preliminary agreements in place before the committee, before applications are submitted to us.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Lucia, I'm gonna keep you on the spot again. There was
Go
a
on.
question here around, does the NREC-MD include expertise in companion diagnostics?
Yes, we do. We do now. Sorry. No, that was the whole point of expanding our membership. So again, that is to accommodate applications that will now come in under IVDR, because so far, actually, interestingly, we have received 2 applications under IVDR, and both of them will have been under for companion diagnostics. So yes.
Fantastic. One last one. In terms of studies that involve artificial intelligence, that fall under MDR, does it require
Yes,
NREC
if they fall under MDR, they come to NREC-MD. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. There was a question about, do we have any more information on the development of regional RECs to align with RHAs? I think that's regional health areas. How will this impact the established RECs, etc.? I think this is actually something for the HSE REC reform, and Anna Therese's team are working on that. So I don't know, Lucy, if you have any comments, but
I don't think we would do it justice, to be honest with you.
No.
I mean, it's such a tremendous amount of work that Anna and her office have put into it. So we would really recommend, when it comes down to the local RECs, to be in touch with them, because again, their infrastructure is growing.
Thank you. There's also a question around combination studies. I think maybe both of you might have comment on this, but are there any recommendations for applicants who can coordinate a response to queries for combination studies? So I don't know if you want to start, and then I see you can jump in.
Yeah, it's really I suppose if they're talking about the response stage, it's the response to RFI. So there are independent opinions, and there will be aspects that are specific to NREC-MD and specific to NREC-CT. So to really tailor those and to look at the relevant legislation to ensure you're really looking at it through the lens of each committee. And we understand it is an extra added aspect to it, but it is really important to put yourself under each separate legislation. Lucy, I don't know if you have anything to add from MD.
No, I think that's really the key here, just having the specific considerations, because of course, there may be one that is more of interest than the other, whether it's the IMP or the device. However, requirements on both sides still need to be met. And I suppose even just having an awareness that if your study involves both, you may need to be subject of review by both. Therefore, please just double check with us and the HPRA if this is the case.
Okay, and I think we've time for one more question. And as I said, there's a lot of questions that have been submitted and that we just won't have time to address today. Sorry, I'm just. So a last question, I suppose, and maybe Lucy, you can talk about this because you're involved in the expression of interest for the membership recruitment. What patient involvement is in these committees that we have?
Oh, phenomenal, I have to say. In my experience, so on the NREC-MD, we now have three PPI members, as we refer to them, but I suppose they're much more than that, number one. And of course, all of us bring in our own experience, and all of the NREC members bring in their own experience. But realistically, I suppose our PPI members are some of the sorry, this is not going to come out right, but they're extremely engaged. They tend to have a really in-depth understanding of each application. They tend to comment on all of the participant-facing documentation. They attend most of the meetings. They are extremely dedicated, and their feedback is invaluable. And I feel like, again, their input is requested in the meetings. They're just such an inherent part of the committee. So what they bring in is absolutely invaluable.
And one last question. Sorry, it's just there was a question regarding decentralized trials, and I suppose the reason I raised it is because it's a question of what kind of guidance we can provide and whether we have a stance on that. And I suppose the question, maybe see you can expand on, is that we don't particularly have guidance on this at the moment, but we can point to the EMA's guidance on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't do it justice, but there is guidance out there from the EMA, and I think Emily had a document which we could link possibly in our outgoing Q&A afterwards, which would give better guidance on this, because there isn't a national position at present, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, and there are a lot of working groups, and the EMA is providing, I suppose, workshops in different areas that are being impacted by the clinical trials regulations. So that website alone is a huge valuable resource.
Absolutely, it's huge.
And if I may just do just one small note, I know there's a lot of question in relation to the ionizing radiation. As Anne-Marie highlighted, we are working on a solution at the moment. It isn't finalized yet. So once we know the nuts and bolts, we may do, God forbid, another webinar, or definitely issue very clear communication on how the process will work, etc., etc. So we're taking note of those questions, and we will address them once we have better and clearer idea on how that will work.
Okay, that is fantastic. Thank you both so much. And thank you everyone who submitted questions. We will do our very best to address those separately once we have time to kind of provide more detail. And I hope you found the session informative and provide a really holistic overview of the work of the National Office and the complexity of the work that we carry out, that ultimately supports our members in making those decisions and delivering those opinions. So without, I'm not going to eat into the break time any further. So we'd like to wrap up this session for this morning. We'll take a quick 10-minute break, and we'll be back at 11:40, and where we will be welcoming our keynote speaker, David Archard, from the Nuffield Bioethics Council. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.